Hello and welcome to another Miko Peled hosted webinar. I'm Jamil and I'll be introducing today's event. The name of the event is The Prospect for Change in Palestine in 2021. So this is a discussion about Palestinian-led activism in the upcoming year. And we have three tireless organizers with us, each representing a distinct region of Palestine, Al-Naqab Desert, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. So we will be highlighting the incredible work of these three Palestinian activists, journalists, and organizers. And I'd like to introduce them to you all. We have Rafat Abu Aish from Al-Naqab. Rafat is a Bedouin Palestinian journalist and activist, and he was one of the main organizers of the protests against the Israeli government's ethnic cleansing program called the Power Plan. We have Baha Hilo from Bethlehem. He is a native Palestinian born and raised in Bethlehem and a graduate of Birzeit University with a degree in sociology. He has worked with different humanitarian, human rights, and advocacy groups, including the UN, YMCA, and the Badr Center for Residency and Refugee Rights. His work experience also includes working with the National Council of the YMCAs in Sri Lanka and Silver Bay Association in New York. Since 2013, he has been focused on education on Palestine through an initiative called To Be There, where he coordinates the different educational visits, including the annual olive harvest, olive planting, Palestinian Land Day, summer study programs, and Christmas in Palestine. And to round out our panel, we have Khaled Farrag from Jerusalem. He is the general director and co-founder of Grassroots Al-Quds since 2010. Working in general administration, strategy, and development of the organization and partner organization and movements. Since 2013, Khaled has been an active member of the founding team of the campaign Urfod, or Refuse, calling to an end the mandatory army service imposed on the Palestinian Druze minority in the 1948 areas, and also reconnecting the Druze population to their Palestinian identity. Khaled studies law at the Hebrew University and graduated from the United World Colleges Network in Norway. So each of today's panelists is in their own way working to build a movement for material change in their individual communities through a lot of different tactics and organizing structures. But as 2021 approaches and the official leadership among Palestine, sits idly by or as we know, collaborates with Israeli security forces, the strength and popular support behind grassroots Palestinian activism becomes so critical and really the only way forward. So in this webinar, we're going to learn about their respective projects, how they tie together to clear the path for a free Palestine, and talk about what can happen and what the expectations are for the upcoming year. So thank you so much to our panel for being with us live from Palestine. We appreciate it. Before I hand it over to Miko, we live stream these events to Miko's Facebook page. So if you want to share this event with anybody or share it on your page, we encourage that. You can just go to facebook.com/Miko Peled official. And I'm also going to make this webinar live via YouTube and Facebook and podcast in the next day or so. So keep an eye out for that. There will also be a post event email sent to everybody. We're going to go for about 60 minutes-ish of conversation, and then we'll do the 20-30 minutes of Q&A. So get your questions in before the 1 hour mark. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar, and I think that should do it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Miko to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Jamil, and thank you to everybody that's joining us and the three excellent panelists. Khaled, Baha, and Rafat. I know you guys. We've met. I've seen you do your work, and I think more than anything, the three of you are if not the best, probably of the top group of people who can talk about the issue of prospects for change in Palestine 2021. The three of you are among a group of Palestinians that I believe are really creating the future of Palestine. You dismantle all the mythology that exists about Palestine, like that there is no Palestinian leadership, like that Palestinians, always waiting for somebody else to come and save them, the fact that Palestinians don't do enough and so forth, and that they don't have a vision. And I know the three of you work tirelessly in your communities, you work tirelessly on the issues that are close to you and close to your communities, but also on issues that are part of the larger Palestinian issue. And another thing that all three of you do, and that I've seen personally and experienced, is giving tours and educating people from the outside about the issues, again, the larger issues of Palestine, but also the more local issues relating to where you all operate. I think the fact that Khaled, you work in Jerusalem, but you have a whole other issue because you come from the north, and you've got, and we'll talk about that in a second, with the refusal movement among the Druze Palestinians. Rafat, you're in the Naqab, and you work with the issues in the Naqab. And Baha, of course, you're in wonderful Bisahur, and you do a lot of stuff there. But again, all three of you do these tours, and they're incredibly deep and serious and educational, and of course political, as they should be. The fact that you each work on your particular issues in that way, and that really the way for all of us to meet is through something like this, I think speaks to one of the problems that exist in Palestine, which is the fact that it's hard to get together. There's a fragmentation that's been imposed on Palestine, on Palestinians by the Zionist occupation, and this is one of the results of that. But what I'd like to do now is go around and ask each and every one of you to speak a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, about your community, the challenges that are typical to your community, and perhaps how they relate to the larger issue of Palestine. Rafat, would you start? Well, maybe we'll go from south to north. So Rafat, why don't you start?
I like going from south to north usually. So, hi everyone. So, I don't know the direct question you're asking, but when I start talking, usually I would be talking about the Mockup. My name is Rafat Abu Aish. I come from a village called Lakia in the northern Mockup. Lakia is a recognized village, which is, and this term is very important to understand the whole geography and the politician geography of the Mockup in order to understand everything that's happening around also. I've been active with a few throughout my life since I've finished high school. I took a part in the anti-Prover Plan movement, which is a youth movement that was created to stop the biggest plan for cleansing the Naqab and persecuting, taking the people's land. The Naqab today is suffering from very wide policies and very wide plans to take people's land and to push people out of the Naqab. It's the last open area in the whole historical Palestine that wasn't occupied by settlements so far and wasn't taken by the Jews. And then the Naqab, you wake up in a situation that that you are persecuted in every way of life and everywhere you go. So you will have to be political, or you might fall in the Israeli trap for being Israeli, for going to the army, for selling your land or leaving. So I studied law. Today I work as a journalist, and yeah, and I've been active in giving tours to people in the Naqab. I do love the Naqab, and they love it when people around are interested and they think that they could help, and that's how I got to know you.
Yeah, and just to give a little more context, the Naqab, people don't realize, but really is the entire southern part of Palestine is the Naqab. And it's a very fertile and very beautiful, they call it a desert, but it's really a very beautiful and very fertile desert, which is why the Palestinian Bedouins are being kicked out and have been
around 60% of the historical Palestinian land is the Naqab, which is really...
Baha, why don't you go next, please?
Thanks, Miko. Yeah, my name is Baha Hilo. I was born and raised in the town of Bethlehem to a refugees family who were expelled into Bethlehem back in 1948. One part of the family was expelled from Jaffa. The other one was from a nearby community, like 20 minutes drive away, called Al-Naqab. Yeah, I work primarily on education on Palestine through tourism for many different reasons, like including the fact that the state of Israel has a monopoly over the tourism industry and pilgrimage, where the Palestinians are completely like hidden away, or in the best case scenario described as like an obstacle for Israel's progress or whatever. I use tourism as a tool for education to help people understand the reality on the ground, where the reality imposed on us by the state of Israel means like all Palestinians who remain in Palestine, let's say the survivors of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, are divided into subjects to 4 different Israeli legal systems, one imposed on us in 78% of Palestine, which is within the internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel, like which is the system imposed on both Khaled and Rafat. Then we have another system imposed on Palestinians in Gaza, another system imposed on Palestinians in Jerusalem. Or the more relevant system that to me personally, or to my life, or to the lives of 3.5 million other Palestinians, is the system imposed on us in the occupied West Bank. It's a militarized system. Like, we are ruled by the Israeli army. They have a military governor and more than 1,650 different laws that interfere in every aspect of our lives. And then have to explain the reality where we have Palestinian leadership ruling over Palestinians under Israeli oppression. So like, let's say for the Israeli soldier, there's no difference between a Palestinian that was born yesterday or the president of Palestine, who's like 87 years old man. Like, both have to live in Palestine through approval of Israeli soldiers and so on. Besides like tourism, of course, like when people come to Palestine, like we understand that they are in Palestine on an Israeli visa. So they have more privileges and access to Palestine than Palestinians have, which is a very weird reality. So we try to take advantage of the presence of internationals in order to provide like a form of civil kind of protection for Palestinians when they work on their land, doing olive harvest or planting the land with olive trees, because the state of Israel is about like robbing every single Palestinian family of its entire property or of part of that property. So, and they do it in a very interesting way. It's, let's say, legalized oppression. So it's legalized land theft. It's land theft nonetheless. So abandoned land or land that is not cultivated would be like the first kind of, or the most common land to be stolen by the Israeli government for the benefits of Jewish Israeli citizens. So when the land is planted with olive trees or with any kind of trees, then the state of Israel would not rob it legally, but they will figure out a different way to rob families of their land. So what we try to do is to make like the best with what we have. And in the same way, like raise awareness and help people understand that the reality in Palestine is not that complicated. The reality in Palestine is very simple. Anybody that is born to a Jewish family is born superior by law. Anybody is born to a Palestinian family is, you know, subject to different Israeli laws that maintain his legal inferiority. So that's kind of like what I work on, but regularly, like besides inviting people to come and be here, because the best way for you to understand Palestine is for you to be physically present there, is through like working with different organizations to fundraise to cover as much land as possible with olive trees. Primarily also because of the fact that the state of Israel has managed to destroy more than 1 million olive trees since the year 1948. And we're talking about ancient trees, like we're talking about trees that were planted by different hands for the past 4,000 years all over the area.
You said to me something about olive trees the other day when we spoke.
Oh, when we were talking about, when we were talking about prospects. Of course, like you learn a lot from like working on the olive sector. The fact that you come to a tree that was planted by nameless individuals over the past 4,000 years. You know, like the prospect, like the reason I would see myself like refusing to give in, refusing to submit is like all what I want to be is like that one nameless person who planted a tree that 1,000 years from today, somebody will live off it, you know? So for me, actually, you learn a lot from being involved in the olive sector. You learn a lot about why the state of Israel wants to destroy that part of our identity, replacing the olive trees with all these like pointless pine trees that they brought from all over the world. Like the Jewish National Fund covered Palestine with 350 million pine trees, none of which is native to the land, and actually it destroys surface soil. It destroys like everything, but it makes Palestine look greener, you know? To fall into the propaganda machine of the state of Israel that claims that it's the Zionists that made Palestine green, which is very weird because now it's winter. You look around and you realize that winter makes Palestine green, and it has been doing that every single year for the past 10,000 years.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt just a sec. Rafat, one time we went and we were in Al-Naqab, I think, and Aziz, the son of the Sheikh, was showing us aerial photographs of the Naqab. They were taken by the British and show that it was cultivated.
Yeah.
And the whole issue of the Zionists making the desert bloom is complete false. Do you remember that, Rafat? Do you remember that?
Yes, I don't want to cut on Baha, but it's very important to put in the context. It's the idea of making the desert green is a very big propaganda for example, for the Jewish National Fund around the world. Planting trees which are brought from Europe and brought from foreigner. We call them colonizer trees. Like they are taking olive trees from their place and putting all of these forests, creating. You have today in the Mockup the biggest man-planted forest in the whole Middle East, which is made by the GNF. The idea is it's another plan to take the land from the people, and then they are also taking trees from their place and put trees that are very foreigner to the land, and they are destroying the land in the first place also.
Yeah, and these are the kinds.
There's a lot of studies about that.
And these are the kinds of things that people never talk about, never hear about, because when they, and this is, I think, also has to do with this whole, how different parts of Palestine are being settled. We hear about the West Bank. We hear very little about the Naqab. We hear very little about the North. We certainly hear very little about resistance from Palestinians within 1948. And Khaled, I'll move to you now. You wear several hats because you work in Jerusalem and you do this really important work in Jerusalem, which I think is, many people will say, is maybe the toughest arena within Palestine, because there's so many issues involved in Jerusalem. But you also work with the Druze community and the refusal to serve in the IDF, which is incredibly important. And I just want to plug in here a movie that was made by my friend Bilal Youssef about the attorney Yamin Zaidan, who is also works on this issue. And that movie, it's on YouTube, available on YouTube. And it shows the difficulty in the struggle and the whole issue of the Druze community and their relation to the IDF and their relations to the state and so on. So tell us about both of these arenas that you work in, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I guess I'll start from the north, even though I started my activism in Jerusalem before I got back to doing the activism around the specific issue of the Druze inscription in the army. So yeah, I come from a small village called Drama in the Upper Galilee. And just to give a small context to this issue in particular, Druze are the only Palestinian community that the army service in Israel is imposed on it, on its men, on males, just like the Jewish community. There's always all these exceptions, like the Orthodox Jews and also the religious Druze and so on. But yeah, that's been true since 1956. So it has become a normal thing for a Druze to go to the army nowadays for different reasons that we might tackle tonight. So I refused to go to the army. I was sentenced a couple of months in a military prison, but then I came to Jerusalem after graduating high school abroad to learn, to study here, and basically face the occupation firsthand for the first time in my life. I came here just as the second Intifada broke out late '99, throughout 2000, and still here. So I also lived different phases of the last 3 decades, the 90s, the fake 90s, and then the reality slamming us in the face with the breakup of the second Intifada, and all the things that developed since here. So yeah, in 2014, we launched a campaign up in the north within the Druze community to first show that there is a refusing movement that has been there since 1956. We just gave it a new voice and reframed voice, a Palestinian voice this time, because it was in a way secluded within the Druze community. Like, refusing was happening, no one was hearing about it, and it was done also quietly for reasons that you might understand, or anyone would understand: fear of the system and fear of the retaliation of the community that has been brainwashed for almost 70 years now, and been assimilated to a certain extent within the Israeli community and society through the door of the military service mainly, but also through the education system. So Yamin, that you mentioned, was also one of the founders of the community, of the movement back in 2013, before we launched. Basically, we try to bring this voice not only to get the Druze youth aware of their history, their true identity, and refuse to join the army, but also to the rest of the Palestinian community that's understandably sees the Druze as mercenaries and sees the Druze as traitors to their Palestinian identity and to their nation by joining as they frame it, the Zionist movement in building Israel even. That's one of the claims that's out there. So basically, while here in Jerusalem and facing the occupation, and that was illustrated in many instances by meeting Druze soldiers stationed here, especially here on checkpoints, on the entrances to the old city, to the Aqsa Mosque as well, in the most, I think, tense and heated up areas, and as well with the highest chance of friction with the Palestinian community. So Palestinians would see the Druze only as soldiers, as part of the army, and forget they were once Palestinians, or they are still, as I see it. And that made me also go deeper into activism around the city I moved to, the capital city, and learn more about what's happening in this really complicated place. So in 2010, I co-founded an organization called Grassroots Jerusalem, or Grassroots Al-Quds. We give tours, like Mikos said, to show the reality firsthand to the visitors of the city, and that also connects to what Baha talked about tourism. Jerusalem has over 4 million visitors a year, mostly religious tourism and historic tourism. That's totally manipulated by the Israeli tourism arms, the ministry, the the agencies, and of course the politics, which basically does a whole erasure of the Palestinian presence in Jerusalem. They're not on the maps. They're also warned not to go to the Palestinian dangerous areas, and there's nothing to see there anyway. That's the narrative that's given to these unaware visitors of the city. Of course, we do get lots of aware visitors, solidarity delegations that we share with to be there at times, and we look at those as people who come to get educated and hopefully educate their grassroots movements back home. So one of the goals of our work is to connect the grassroots level rather than work on policy level decision makers, classical advocacy as it is framed in political science today globally. We don't believe in that anymore. We believe, and has been evident in the movements around many struggles around the world, especially in the US, how these connections between struggles for justice are very important. We research a lot. We basically want to tell the history of the city and the reality of it today with the Palestinian voice. Basically, we make sure that the Palestinian voice, the Palestinian narrative is out there, is leading the story. And that's how we create our research, by putting these stories, both the factual information with the oral history and the story of the people in the city. And the last thing we research is the policies that are imposed on Jerusalem, that have many layers and been shifting over the past few years. And I think that will connect greatly to the topic of this panel about what's about to happen in these places in 2021.
Thank you. Yes, and in Jerusalem, the erasure and the replacement of the history with a biblical narrative, with this made-up history that the Zionists are pushing and perpetuating, is a serious problem, because very often they will destroy monuments and destroy archaeological findings that are not relevant to their political agenda, and then create all these other, like the biblical park, the King David, or the City of David archaeological park, and so on, and on the way destroying important archaeological sites that have been there, for more than 1,000 years. And this is a big problem. And maybe you could talk about that also a little bit in the next round. Rafat, I want to go back to you, back to the South. A couple of things. You mentioned recognized and unrecognized village, so maybe you can touch on that a little bit, what that means. And also, there is an issue of a military draft, a draft to the IDF among the Bedouin Palestinians as well, as far as I know. So maybe you can touch on that. But beyond those two things, maybe you could talk about Haraba, this new organization that you founded with some other activists in doing work for the Naqab.
Okay, so we'll start by talking about the Naqab a bit. Well, today in the Naqab there are more than 200,000 to 270,000 people living. We're talking about Palestinians who stayed after Nakba, when 90% of the population was kicked or killed by the Israeli gangs. People in the Naqab have Israeli citizenship, but they don't have equal rights, and they are being persecuted by the Israeli government through policies like home demolitions, discriminations and rights, and legal persecution, fines. We talked about unrecognized villages, and you asked, so the idea of there are three shapes of communities for Arabs in the Naqab. The first one is the unrecognized village. Around 140,000 or more of the population of the Naqab lived in unrecognized village. Unrecognized means it's a town that has no services, no electricity, no water, no sewerage, no roads. all the services that the people have are built by their own efforts. And when they buy water, for example, from the Israeli company for water, Mikos, they would pay 3 times the price that normal people would pay or Jews would pay. The electricity that the people have is only taken from solar panels or generation, mostly solar panels. There's no services in the towns themselves, and people are getting home demolitions. More than when we talk about home demolitions in the Mockup, it's the biggest issue people are suffering from today. In the year 2018, 2,775 houses were demolished in the Mockup, which is more than the houses that were demolished in all Palestinian areas in the same year. The year after, it was a number close to that, 2,500 houses and more. The problem is that even if you get home demolished, yani, the Israeli government would come demolish your house and then would make you pay for demolishing your house, which is fines that go to more than 100,000 shekels for a home demolish, yani around $25,000. People, when you talk about the Naqab, it's also important to mention that more than 60% of the population of the Naqab is poor. Due to the Israeli numbers after the coronavirus this year, the percentage is much higher. Yani more than 70% of the population is poor. When you talk about poor, it's much poor. Yani people cannot find food in this case, and they are living on the help of association. So there are 3 types of communities: recognized villages, which is towns that are planned by the Israeli government to the Arabs. We will talk about 7 towns today. The problem with these towns is that they suffer from poor also. There's a great difference between the Jewish towns that are next to the planned towns. Yani you get low budgets for schools. You get you don't have land to build. You get also home demolitions in the planned towns. The third type of community is newly recognized towns, which are towns that got recognitions in the year 2000, but still didn't get services in the same house. So it's only recognition on the paper, and people get home demolitions also. So these are the 3 types of communities for Arabs in the Mockup. The difference between Arabs and Jews in the Mockup it's also important to mention that the Israeli government is trying very hardly to bring Jews from the center and from the north to the Naqab and to get more population into the Naqab because it's crowded in Tel Aviv and in all this city. So if you are Jewish, you can get lots of tips by the government to live in the Naqab. You can ask for a loan farm, for example, which is a very growing concept for Jews in the Naqab. A Jewish family could come and say, I dream of living in the Naqab. They would take, the government might give them until 10,000s of dunams of lands to build houses on them and to stay there. They'll give them electricity, water, even Wi-Fi. So, and one of the main examples important is in the year 2016, there was a plan to demolish a village called Al-Hiran in the Naqab. And it was, the village is going to be demolished, and already a big part of it was demolished, in order to build a Jewish settlement in its place called Hiran. So the Israeli government, the people of Al-Hiran were moved to that area by the Israeli army in the year of Nakba and after. And they stayed there for 60 years with no services, no water, no electricity, no roads. Even the ambulances wouldn't get there if a fire got in the village. And there are lots of stories of people dying because there was no help by the government. Even though people stayed in there, the town was recognized to be demolished by the Israeli government to build the settlement in this place. Next to it, there is a lone farm called Golden Dog. It has only one family, only one Jewish family in there, and it works as a hotel and a cemetery for dogs. And it has electricity, water, a doctor visiting every week, Wi-Fi, cables, and all. So that's the discrimination in Al-Naqab. For the question of the army in Al-Naqab, through the years, the Israeli government tried to make the population of the Naqab Israeli as much as they could. They tried to to fold the people into going to the army, to tell them that if you go serve in the Israeli army, you wouldn't get home demolished, to sell lies and then try to recruit people as much as they can. And it's one method that Israel uses all the time, that it convinced is convincing the Palestinian population that it's divested, so that some populations do serve in the army with their willing. How do they do that? people imagine every time you go to that discussion, people imagine that there's a lot of Bedouins serving in the army, but that's not true. When you go to the Israeli numbers for the year 2016, the IDF numbers say that there are only 250 Bedouins in the army with the Keva, which means the all-time soldiers that were in the army. So that's a very small number comparing to the population. We're talking about 270,000 people. And but how does Israel do that and convince people that Bedouins or Druze or people are serving in the army? By putting the Arabs in the points that the Arab touch, in border and checkpoints and stuff like that, in order to show that there are Arabs in the Israeli army. But that's actually not true. People in here do not accept recruits most of the people, and like in the Gaza war, for example, there were like tens of cases of if Bedouin or an Arab soldier would die in the war, they would bury him in the night, and the father would never say I had a son who was in the army. People will not give their daughters to marry army people. So and even though there are hundreds of millions of budget that are being invested in that case, people do not accept the army. And in the second Intifada majorly, there was a lot of participants from the Bedouin population in that through fighting and through protesting and through lots of Bedouins were arrested for, like, example, gun smuggling and stuff, and it was very armed resistance against occupation at the time.
Yeah, and the disparity between the Jews and the Palestinians in the Naqab, I think one of the things that you've shown me, standing and seeing Omer, which is the Jewish town, which is one of the richest towns, Israeli towns, period. And across the street is Tel El-Saba, which is really a township, which is one of the poorest, right?
The comparison is like this. Tel El-Saba is considered to be the poorest village in Israel in the rate of welfare for the country. Omer is like the fourth richest town, and they are just 1 kilometer away from each other. You can see this and you can do that. With the years, Tel El-Saba has turned into a ghetto. There's lots of stories of how, because Tel El-Saba was a resisting village with the years, and people would have been very far from creating communications and relationships with the Israeli government, and they stick with their Palestinian identity. There are lots of testimonies of people that it got with the Israeli police to the situation that the Israeli police were selling drugs from their cars to the people at the time in order to manifest or put drugs in the village itself. So there's lots of methods, and the catastrophic results of planning and urbanizing the people and making the Bedouins creating towns out of tents, and then making people live in towns and taking the land from the people. It's very important to understand that Bedouins owned the whole Naqab with the before Nakba, and used to live, every tribe or every town live in their original land. So once you took most of the land in the Naqab, and you put everybody in one area, which is called the siege area. It's less than 4% of the Naqab's area, and then you just left them that way. Then you have violence, you have drugs, you have the worst scenarios, and the government is leaving the people and is persecuting the people. That's the only thing. All the Israeli government, that's the only thing they are doing.
Yeah. Hey, Baha, I want to go back to you now. You live in Bet Sahur near Bethlehem, which is really one of the most beautiful spots, in Palestine, with a rich, long history, it's long traditions, with gorgeous buildings. And it's a big tourist, especially Bethlehem is a big tourist resort. But the tourists that come from Israel in and out miss a great deal of what's there. And you, in the tours that you organize and the connections that you make, touch on all of those issues. And you're also connected with organizations overseas a lot, and you do a lot of work with organizations in other countries. Can you talk a little bit about both of those things, please? And talk a little bit about Bet Sahur too. And yeah. You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I'm a technology Neanderthal. I was telling the organizers before. So anyways, yeah, Beit Sahur is like a pretty ancient town. Like even the name like is from like biblical times. Beit means home, and Sahur means vigilance, and it's a reference to like a few shepherds that the angel Gabriel appeared to them and told them to go spread the news about the birth of Christ in the town of, or in the city of David, which is another biblical reference to the town of Bethlehem. Yeah, if you don't believe in angels, then this is definitely not the town for you to live in, because everyone has to, like, whether you're Christian or Muslim or atheist, it doesn't matter. You have to believe in angels to, you know, to respect the identity of the town. So yeah, like it's a town that has been vibrant for about 2,000 years. Bethlehem has been vibrant for about 4,000 years. Jerusalem, like, you know, when you are talking about like old towns in Palestine, you are talking about vibrant communities that have been going on like with human evolution for thousands and thousands of years. You know, like the oldest town in Palestine is Jericho, and we're talking about 10,000 years of human history in it, which is like really fascinating. Like one of the things that made me wish the state of Israel is not oppressive and it's not racist and it's not imposing all those like measures on us is to have time to explore this fascinating history of Palestine. But unfortunately, like ever since the founders of the state of Israel like came in and destroyed Palestinian society, like we are focusing on our modern history more than we are focused on the amazing history in like thousands and thousands of years of human history is pretty fascinating. So like what I try to do is like to show that yes, there is vibrant life has been going on for thousands of years, but we are disappearing. Because like whether we like it or not, like one of the major outcomes of Israel's destruction of Palestinian society is that 66% of all of us Palestinians are not allowed to live at home. We all belong to families that were robbed of their properties or completely or partially. Like the town of Beit Sahur is not it's not a town that was ethnically cleansed, unlike the 530 communities or unlike all Palestinian communities that were ethnically cleansed, as the 70,000 criminals were pushing Palestinians out in 1947, 48, and 49. So it's still like the local community is still here. And it's a fascinating town where like nobody is expelled yet. All the 7 major families or the local families in this town have been robbed of big parts of their properties due to Israeli policies. So when we're looking at Palestine, we're not looking at it from a point of view of like this history is disconnected from reality. Like we look at it as a form of human evolution with a new challenge. Because whether we like it or not also, like Palestine was ruled and destroyed by and rebuilt by nearly 23 civilizations over the past 6,000 years, and the state of Israel is the latest one of them. So try to put everything in its larger context and then zoom in to see how like the state of Israel has managed to impose, you know, an oppressive racist regime on Palestinians and explain the outcomes of those realities. When people think of Palestine as complicated reality, like it's not complicated at all, but it's made intentionally complicated. One of the things like I always remind people of is that the Israeli oppression is not a matter of Palestinians' behavior. Like it doesn't matter how we behave. It doesn't matter if we, let's say, if we are Bedouins or Druze who choose to serve in the Israeli army or serve in the Israeli army. Or if we were Bedouins or Druze or like Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza who carry arms against the Israeli army, and everyone is in between. Like the Israeli oppression is not relevant to our behavior as Palestinians as much as it's relevant to our very, very existence. The state of Israel decides how you will be mistreated for the rest of your lives the day you are born. So whatever you do between birth and death is really irrelevant. Like not one Palestinian for the past 70 plus years, 72 years, not one Palestinian have managed to reach the level of equality under the state of Israel. Like you have Rafat and Khaled who can talk to you about like more than 60 different laws that maintain their inferiority compared to that of a Jewish individual, you know? Why is that? Simply because they were born. Like Miko, you were born here, and you were born superior not because of your behavior, but because you were born to a certain type of a family, right? So it's a matter of birth. To try to explain all those things in an easy to understand way is what I've been doing. Like, why am I doing this? I do it simply because, like, I totally believe that the destruction of Palestine was brought from outside. You know, the ruling ideology of the State of Israel is a European ideology, is a white man's ideology. And there's a whole lot of ignorance surrounding Palestine in white man's society. So I'm a person who views ignorance as an opportunity for education. So I feel like the more we try to educate people on the happenings in Palestine, the more we help them realize what is happening here, how systematic it is, how criminal it is, the more people will be able to stand up when the time comes to, let's say, shut down Israeli embassies. So it's not about like education for the sake of education. Like, we're not doing advocacy work for the oppressed Palestinians. At the end of the day, if you are in solidarity with the oppressed people, it tells more about you as an individual, how decent of a person you are, more than it tells anything about oppressed people. Like you being, let's say, in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, for example, tells more about your decency as a human being than it tells about the opportunity for an Afro-American to have a life where he enjoys equality, right?
And in many ways,
so,
Palestinians are a lot less occupied, actually, than their oppressors.
Well, in the end of the day, like what I focus on is, what I focus on mostly is like break down the 4 different systems, help people understand that, yes, the State of Israel is not an apartheid state. It doesn't have one apartheid system. The State of Israel has 4 separate apartheid regimes that all the time maintain the superiority of an individual who was born to a Jewish family and the inferiority of a person who was born to a Palestinian family. And those 4 systems produce the regular outcomes. The regular outcomes of Israeli policy are very clear. Land robbery is one, elimination of Palestinian society to the level where 66.5% of us are not allowed to live on our family's property, are not allowed to live at home, and then give the impression that Palestine has an absolute majority of Jewish individuals, even though like the State of Israel rules a majority of Palestinians rather than Jewish individuals. So that education also has to go with work, you know, like I don't like bringing people here who will just come and look and just have like a conflict tour, let's say. No, like we take advantage of the fact that none of the, let's say, the visitors is subject to Israeli military rules. Like, you should understand that Israeli military rule is applicable on Palestinians. It's not applicable on those who come in with through Israeli border control areas, you know? So let's say a person with an American passport is not subject to Israeli military regulations because he's a civilian. So we took advantage of that by, once again, like going out, helping families. Like we did like renovation of water cisterns that the State of Israel continuously destroyed, rebuilding demolished homes, planting olive trees, helping out with the olive harvest, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about being here, we try to help people be here with all their senses. And then when they go home, they show a good level of understanding of how systematic Israeli oppression is.
Yeah, and that's true even when I'm there. When I'm there, if you know, the rules that apply to me and the rules that apply to, well, actually either one of you are not the same, whether we're at the airport, whether we're at a checkpoint, whether we're stopped by police.
Miko, you can slap a soldier on the face,
yeah.
and there's nothing he can do about it.
I won't be treated like Ahed Tamimi if I slap a soldier.
Like Ali Abu Alia, like the kid that was murdered last week, he was not even looking at a soldier when he received that bullet, you know?
Khaled, I wanna move to you again, talking about the two spheres that you operate in, which I find, you know, it's very interesting that you're operating in these two, you're really bringing together these two spheres. What do you see in terms of people reacting to your work, both Palestinians and not Palestinians, to the work that you're doing on both of these spheres, and moving into this issue of, okay, what is 2021? What are the possibilities for 2021? Activism, like the work that you guys are doing, is really all that's there. I mean, you guys are doing the hardest, the most important, and really most of the work in terms of liberating Palestine. So, two things. What do you see? What are people saying? What kind of reactions are you getting to the work that you do on these two fronts? And what do you see in terms of what is your vision? What do you see in terms of what might happen next year?
Okay.
It's a big question, I know.
Yeah. So basically our work in Jerusalem, I'll start with that because that's like the daily routine of my life. That's my job also. So it's less my volunteering activism that I do in the North. And we see it mostly in the tours, in the reaction we get when we speak our narrative that is considered too radical at instances by peace movements even, and so on. I think the immediate reaction when people go on the tour is some sort of a shock, because they might hear about it and might hear also a counter narrative that is given by the Israeli propaganda in the US and so on, and their lobbyists there, and find it hard to pick and choose what is the truth. But when they do see it for their own eyes, and they see the wall, and they see the settlement smack in the middle of a Palestinian neighborhood, or even in a Palestinian house that was evicted of its own original residents, and also how the city is basically fragmented within itself, and of course totally separated from its Palestinian continuation to the West Bank by the checkpoints and the wall, the expansion, and apartheid wall. I think that's the main reaction that we look for, because that's a truth that you see and you can't deny anymore. And then when you go back and give a first-hand account of what you've seen to your community, that's the most important tool we use to reach and bypass the political classical advocacy that is really conditioned by sets of rules, the international law and the UN resolutions that are merely I would say slogans nowadays that don't really affect things that are happening on the ground. Especially we see that now with the Israeli policies moving forward, using the rest of the small time that Trump has left to put facts on the ground, new settlements in Jerusalem, a new confiscation of areas for the favor of the settlements, but also shifting gears towards a new strategy that we are seeing, I think, in the whole of the region and in the whole of Palestine, and especially in Jerusalem, which is normalization. normalization has
Khaled,
become.
I want to, something just came to mind that I want to ask you about in regards to Jerusalem. I don't know if the people listening know this or appreciate this, but the Israeli Minister for Jerusalem Affairs, Rafat Peretz, is a messianic, radical, right-wing religious, I don't know what, who's I don't want to say lunatic because I think he does not even considered a lunatic anymore in Israeli politics, but he holds the keys to a lot of what is happening in Jerusalem, and he is one of the people who believes in building a Jewish temple in Al-Aqsa instead of Al-Aqsa. Do you see that, his influence? Do you see that in your daily work in Jerusalem?
I think it happened before he came into this office, specifically, like the radicalization and the boldness of these settler movements in the Arab neighborhoods in the Old City, around Al-Aqsa Mosque. We call them invasions of these groups of settlers that has intensified over the past 2 years. Also, again, to normalize that scene in Jerusalem, that Jews, settler Jews, ideological, fanatic ones mostly, are present in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example. But yeah, that's just, I think, an illustration of their growing strength in Israeli politics over the past decade, where I think the Israeli map of right and left totally vanished, and now it's been just shifting right more and more, and that's just another symptom. This guy in office, who is not only a radical fanatic settler, but also a homophobe, women, or I don't know how to call him. He's just that type of person who everyone would normally be against on so many levels, and now he is a normal figure in Israeli politics as well. And that's what I was just getting to when I was talking about normalization. And I'm not talking about normalization in the sense of Israelis and Palestinians doing normalization actions together, but the use of normalization as the new weapon by Israeli policy propaganda on different levels, normalization with Arab countries at this point, but also normalization with the Palestinians in here in disguise, in a way, especially in Jerusalem. Like, the whole idea was to keep the Palestinian population in Jerusalem small, tiny, ineffective, not influencing the daily life of the city by ethnic cleansing, using different tools. And what we've been witnessing over the past 2 years, I would say, is a shift towards, okay, accepting that reality that we cannot really kick them all out, and some of them will stay here, and the way to contain them is by Israelizing them, basically bringing them to normalize the Israeli society, the Israeli authorities, and even through education. Now, any Palestinian from Jerusalem who is not a citizen, and maybe I should have pointed that complexity in the beginning, Palestinians of Jerusalem have Israeli IDs but not citizenships, which makes them seem privileged, but actually it's the opposite. I think they are in the worst situation amongst all Palestinians in terms of the complexity they have to live through every day. So any Palestinians today can go to the Hebrew University, get accepted for free, get a preparative year of learning language and all the basics that you need, and get free education. That's something new. Also inserting the Israeli curriculum into the Palestinian schools there. That's another major tool that's happening right now. And it's true, I think, throughout Palestine as well. In 1948, maybe Gaza is the only exception, but also in the West Bank, and I think Baha can testify to that even more, the giving, now it's just being discussed, giving more permits for work in Israel to more Palestinians, bringing that or creating that dependency of livelihood of the Palestinian families in the West Bank on the Israeli economy even more, and also making them quiet, not resisting, fearing the loss of that income, eventually controlling the masses through that tool, and quieting down the resisting voices, even by the PA, even by the unfortunately partner in crime in this context. So yeah, regarding the Druze, the reaction is by, let's call it, the international community is okay, I'm learning something new, I never heard of Druze. It's an interesting also anecdote about how Israel fragments to conquer and divide and rule the community, and make that separation between the small, the religious separation in this case between the factions within the one community. But I think the more interesting for me reaction is when I talk to Palestinians in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, about this issue, and them being shocked first to hear Jews speak these words and believe these beliefs. Second, some sort of instant solidarity that happens, and it's kind of a magic because okay, once they start seeing you as a Palestinian, the whole atmosphere change. Because I've met Palestinians who have never met Druze except as a soldier on a checkpoint, who harasses them even more deeply than the Jewish one.
I'm laughing because that's a reaction. That's the experience that I have also when I'm with Palestinians.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, also, and I'll have to say this: every time I was arrested and questioned, it was always there were always Druze, whether they're the arresting ones in the West Bank, and whether even in the police, the Shabak or whoever they were that are interrogating, or at the checkpoints. It's always been Druze. Which is,
that's because you're not arrested in Tel Aviv. You're arrested in these locations, and Druze are, as also Rafat mentioned, are intentionally stationed in these places.
Of course. Well, I want to, we need to start wrapping up, so I'm going to throw something at all three of you, and I want a quick response. Not quick, but, you know, a thoughtful but fast response. Israeli elections are coming up again. I mentioned Rafi Peretz, who is the Minister for Education, he was Minister of Education, I think. Now he's Minister for Jerusalem Affairs, which is not a coincidence. I think two names that you all know and we should all fear are Naftali Bennett and Bezalel Smotrich, who are, I think, the upcoming stars in the Israeli political world. And you know, but maybe not all the people listening know, that their idea of the future of Palestine, of the future of Palestinians, is that Israel gives Palestinians three choices. They can remain as subservient non-citizens, they can leave, or they can fight and die. Those are really the three options that these people who are coming up and will very likely have even more influence and more powerful positions. On the other side of that is, you know, BDS, the call for BDS, the demand to impose boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel, and the idea that the Zionist regime must be brought down and replaced with a real democracy with equal rights, one person, one vote, decolonization of Palestine and the return of the refugees. How do you survive with between these two, between this reality that's coming and this vision and this resistance that's hoping to accomplish something that is so completely different? So let's go around again from maybe south to north, and quickly, if you can talk about these two conflicting ideas and how we go from one to the other, hopefully. Rafat, go ahead, please.
Yo, I'll always take part in panels where you start from the south to the north. I like that. That never happened before.
I have an
So,
affinity. I like the Naqab.
we like you too. So I'll be putting what I think like this. Put, yeah, the whole event it's called Prospects of Change when it comes to young activism in Palestine. So when considering the Israeli elections or the change in the political side and in the Israeli work or in the whole Israeli image, we don't rely much on any changes that happen with the Israeli personalities or with the Israeli politics or with the Israeli mentality. We seriously, I don't think any Palestinian activist who consider himself as a national Palestinian or who believes in change when it comes to the Palestinian situation could like relays or puts any pressure on the Israeli elections. We once took this part and we believed in change inside the Israeli politics. Maybe some of us supported the Arab Joint List or supported the Arab leadership or believed that something could change in that way. But that was always missing something. Yeah, I mean, you always carry the pin of the BDS, which is Pickup Divest Sanction. So when it comes to BDS, the three claims of the BDS, which you just mentioned, they provide justice for, they wouldn't provide justice for the Palestinians, they would provide the stop of injustice that's happening now. But justice for the Palestinians is by judging Israel for all the pain that the Palestinian people have suffered through the years, which is still a very far step from going there. I would say again what Jamal Abdel Nasser once said, which is what was taken by force will be getting back only by force. And with that we mean like activism, sticking with your identity and sticking with the Palestinian roots and with the eye-to-eye fight with the occupation, that you never should lay down to the occupier that's taking your land and taking your roots and you're suffering injustice from. And when it comes to prospects of change, the things we have been through and the fights we have been inside as Israeli citizens and inside the Naqab taught us that only the young and only the people in the streets are the one who would create the future. People have fought through the Israeli politics years in the Knesset and stuff, for example, to stop the proverb plan at the time. And the only way you could stop was a very loud protest called the Hura protest, the anger protest at the time, when you close streets and you close the entrance of Hura for a full night. And you will be fought back and you will be shot at, and people got live rounds at that in that time, and they are Israeli citizens, but they are also Palestinian. So discrimination is truth, and occupation is truth. But it comes to the young and to the youth to fight that. You before asked me also about Haraba. So I think all of the Palestinian activists everywhere are trying to go, trying to change the taboos that we had before, and what the olds with all of the struggle that they have been through got or thought sometimes change should happen on the Palestinian side and inside. On the Palestinian leadership and on the Arab 48 leadership that's happening now. Haraba, for example, is a project to create job opportunities inside the unrecognized villages and use that also to create cultural centers and educate kids through creating spots that you can bring people into. We talked about unrecognized villages and we talked about how discrimination is there, and there is not any services, there is no any cultural centers, there's not, people are being made ignorant with the Israeli policies. So I believe in young initiatives and in people who would be proud of where they come from and would fight for that pride. I hope I answered some of your questions.
You did, thank you. Baha, go ahead.
Yeah, like the way I relate to Israeli politics or Israeli elections is, I think, pretty much similar to the way like South Africans related to elections in apartheid South Africa. You know, a white man elects a white man that will be for the best or worst service of the white man, and all black people will be.
You froze.
Hello?
Yeah, you just froze. So you stopped with what happens when the white man votes for a white man. No, he's freezing. Let's give him another second and maybe we'll go to Khaled while he fixes this problem.
Bethlehem people are known to be froze sometimes.
No, that's
Are you
Bejala.
back? Are you back?
Yeah, that is Bejala. Like it freezes.
Yeah, because it's so far apart. Bejala, Bethlehem. Baha, are you there? Because there's a problem with the Wi-Fi. One, two, three. Okay, Khaled, why don't you go ahead and answer those questions, and we'll go back to Baha when he solves the problem.
Hello?
I think his problem is also political, just to give some context.
And now you're muted. You're muted, Baha. I mean, Khaled, you're muted.
The Israelis are in the conversation, Miko.
Oh, of course they are. Maybe they will learn something.
Inshallah.
Maybe I think Baha is back.
Baha, are you back?
Another shot.
I think so.
Okay, let's try.
Okay.
So a white man voting for a white man.
Yeah. So like the way I relate to Israeli elections, I think like all of us, like especially Palestinians who have an opinion about it. So like our opinion about Israeli elections is kind of like irrelevant, because like we are waiting for the Israeli public to produce another oppressor. So that's it. Like from the first elections in the state of Israel, like that was, I think, won by David Ben-Gurion, who's responsible for murdering more than 15,000 Palestinians. We've been ruled by Ben-Gurions. The difference between them is like the number of Palestinians they murdered, the number of Palestinians they turned homeless, the number of Palestinian families they robbed of their property. So that's the outcome of his Israeli elections. I would like to see like an Israeli election like completely outside the Zionist ideology, you know, in the same way like we managed to see an elections taking place in South Africa outside the apartheid ideology. So and then maybe I'll have an opinion, and maybe then I'll choose not to participate. But until then, like the outcomes of Israeli control over Palestine continues to be the same. More Palestinians expelled. Service is primarily provided for the maintenance of the regime, for the maintenance of the state the way it is, and yeah, these are the ongoing realities. Now, yes, I see like how we would see like Naftali Bennett or whatever like racist figure serving in the Israeli parliament would be like more aggressive. But I have a lot of hope from the fact that we survived like a lot of criminals. We survived Ben-Gurion, we survived Moshe Dayan, we survived Begin, we survived Ariel Sharon, and just bring it on. Like we do the exact same thing that every oppressed society has done through oppression, which is primarily survival, you know? Right now, like that's what we collectively do. And I guess like I don't see anything beyond, you know, survival that we can collectively do, which is like when you look at it in this way, like Israeli oppression has been going on for 70 years. Not many of us as Palestinians like are even aware of the depth of Israeli oppression, because we are very much focused on finding shelter, very much focused on feeding our kids, very much focused on, you know, the day-to-day issues that any normal human being is focused on, while we live in a completely abnormal reality. So like I honestly like believe like the best thing we can collectively as Palestinians do is to continue surviving Israeli oppression, regardless of who is doing the oppressing. Because the only outcome of Israeli elections is another racist figure that's either okay with maintaining an inferior status for Palestinian individuals, or is actively, you know, taking advantage of that form of inferiority. So yeah, like if they will bring us bayonet, like I would say, bring it on. You know, what else? Like, you know, like when we're talking about 66% of the entire Palestinian society, you know, being displaced, 66% of us, more than half of us are not even allowed to step a foot in Palestine, you know? So how is Bennett going to make it worse? Like if Bennett is going to do anything, he might finish the 66% to 100%, you know? But which I think is difficult, and it's impossible without like Nazi-like bloodshed. But if that doesn't happen, then we'll continue to survive. Just bring it on.
Okay.
The outcome, I think,
yes.
we can hope. What we can hope for is like also, as Rafat said, and as you said, is like we need to figure out a way to transform advocacy and solidarity into a form of resistance through BDS. We need to start figuring out a way to focus more on the S in the campaign, because without political sanctions, we have no hope. Every day, there is an Israeli embassy operating from any capital in the world. Then we are looking at a department that is responsible for maintaining the oppression of the Palestinian people. So if we do not come to a platform where we start discussing how we can work on kicking out Israeli representatives, shutting down Israeli embassies, imposing like political sanctions on the state of Israel as long as it maintains its racist laws against Palestinians in Israel, as long as it continues to deny the Palestinians from practicing their right of return, as long as it finds it okay to rule Palestinians through military means, you know? Because like sanctions should be conditioned. Like if the state of Israel eliminates those 3 violations, then things will be all right. As you said it once in your lectures, like things will be all right the second day. We will be focusing on rebuilding ourselves, and we'll be focusing on living a life where, you know, people who have Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, Druze, Bedouins, like whatever you name it, will be equal under one political regime.
And then we can do what Rafat was saying, which is to punish the culprits and punish the criminals and go for
like criminals will be
that step, which
to give the leadership to the Bedouins,
which is of course crucial. Yes, so that will be paradise.
Miko,
right?
dear, like I do not think that we would have the time to identify and prosecute the criminals, maybe like the major criminals. But do remember that the state of Israel produces criminals over and over again. Like every single Israeli soldier is responsible for serving a criminal gang, like, you know.
Tell me about it.
So let's be realistic about this. Also, let's be realistic, like not all white supremacists were persecuted in apartheid South Africa. Not even all the soldiers, you know, not all the police officers. So we need to be a little bit realistic and then have answers for how to deal with those criminals, you know?
Yeah,
like
a lot of times,
Can I discuss Baha a bit, Miko, on that?
Thank you.
Can I discuss Baha on that a little bit, or don't we? We don't have that.
Go ahead. Why not? Of course.
No, I just remember the saying for George Habash when you once say that the Palestinian revolution was built to do the impossible, not the possible.
Yeah.
So the idea, I too much like I'm always scared of the whole term realistic, because the Palestinian leadership is always using that to be realistic and to do a two-state solution and to do more tansiq amni, and like I know you're not saying that, Baha. I know you're not saying that. But the whole idea is there's nothing realistic about our situation and about occupation. The whole idea is I think Palestine keeps living on the fighters' heart. That's the whole idea. And even if the situation is not allowing you to be a rebel as much as you wanna be, but you should be a rebel in heart always to be, and to give the people their historical rights, which is not the now rights. I want to stop injustice, but I always want to punish for injustice and do, for example.
Yeah, like the way I meant realistic, like we live in a completely unrealistic reality.
True.
So realistic in the sense that you can live in a situation where people have the exact same rights regardless of who their mother is, like, or what family they were born to. That's what I meant by realistic.
Yeah.
Now,
I understand, but always keep that you are the one who was in pain in 70 years of occupation. You have the right to be compensated, and you have the international right for all Palestinian refugees, for example, around the world, decision 194 by the UN, that people should be compensated for being kicked out from Palestine. And you have international rights, and you have the ethical right for yourself to fight, and your fight is very just. And I know you believe in that process.
But I do believe in that. I also believe that the fulfillment of somebody's rights does not mean the violation of somebody else's right.
And I think that's one of the cases that I think is very clear about the Palestinian situation.
Yeah.
Is it really the Palestinian demands is not to hurt anybody, but it's to remedy
honestly,
justice. That's why it's called justice.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to Khaled.
Just last thing.
Go ahead.
When all our families would be granted the right to equality and the right to their property and so on, I doubt that they will be focused on anything but rebuilding their lives.
No, of course, I know. I don't think the concern is ever the Palestinian violence. I think the concern is always
like
and the Zionist.
When slaves were freed, they were not looking for ways to enslave white people. Like I don't think like they were busy exploring this new reality of freedom. And the three of us, Khaled, Rafat, and myself, like I think we are 30 in our 30s and 40s. We never lived a day of freedom. So when that happens, I think we will be busy exploring like how that feels, you know.
Rafat has just added 10 years to his life. Okay, Khaled, go ahead. You're next.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a bit of here and there regarding that remark. I don't think we should waste our time when liberation happens on revenge, but justice. Yeah, justice and build up, of course. And there are lots of things to consider at that point, rather getting stuck on that. But I do want to go back to your question, Miko, regarding the Druze context, because it is actually an interesting case, especially there, since, as I said, Druze have been assimilated for decades, since the 50s, into the Israeli community through many tools. And the result today is that a significant portion of them is brainwashed, is Zionist even, I would say. We call them, in our terminology, the Zionist Druze today, who, for example, like 2 parliaments ago, we had 6 representatives in the Israeli parliament out of 120, and we are less than 2% of the population. We are like 100,000. So even if all the Druze voted for Druze candidates, we wouldn't, pass the, I don't know how they call it, even the margin that allows you, and the 3.5% margin that allows you into the Israeli parliament, which is also an indicator why the Druze are an interesting case in terms of elections. So the image of the Druze is that all of them are, you know, right-wing in the Israeli politics, are assimilated, as I said, but over the last two elections, I mean, two real elections, not the one covering up for the other, the last three, the Druze majorly voted for the Arab joint list, 40%. And people don't realize that. I don't vote, I boycott the Israeli elections, but that is an indicator of how the information is misleading regarding the Druze community in Palestine. The strengthening of the right, exampled in Bennett and Smotrich, has done us a great favor, basically, within the Druze community. That coming together with the laws, the latest nation-state law, the Jewishness of the state, and the enforcement law of demolitions, the Kamenetz law, woken up the Druze community about how discriminated they are still against after 70 years, even though if they, or portion of them serves in the Israeli army. And that is something positive I can take from the Israeli elections and the way, the direction it's going towards within that context. Regarding BDS and using it as a tool, I always keep reminding myself to tell the world that basically Palestinians have all the tools at their disposal to resist and fight back legally, because we are in a state of war, and in the war, even violent resistance is accepted, and therefore we shouldn't be shy about BDS. What's happening now in Germany and of course in the States about demonizing BDS as an anti-Semitic act is a good example of our shyness about, like, no, BDS is not, it's peaceful, it's just another tool of many, a basket of tools that we need to use. It's very effective today, and we need to strengthen it because it's talk directly with the people. It doesn't have to go through governments and policies and parliaments around the world. So I think BDS today is the best answer to all these normalization attempts Israel is doing, both regionally, locally, and so on. And yeah, I think we need to keep faith that that deterioration on the ground will reach a bottom that helps us, that gives us opportunities we don't have right now in Israeli politics. So sometimes I tell people, just sit and watch at instances what's happening there, learn from it, and find the opportunities where the weaknesses are appearing more and more in the Israeli politics, in the Israeli public even, drifting away from reality and from truths that are on the ground, and trying to portray narratives that are merely based on myths, basically.
Yeah, and I like what you said about no need to apologize, and that's one of the reasons I like the three of you, is you're unapologetically participating in this issue, resisting the reality in which you live, and again, unapologetically Palestinian, unapologetically supporting your rights, period. All three of you come from really magnificent places in Palestine. Palestine is a small country, but it's so diverse. I've been to Ramah. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. In the Galilee, Jerusalem, of course, is wonderful. Bet Sahur, the Naqab. I mean, these are beautiful places. And I have to say, you guys, I've been to tours with all of you, and you've shown me and taught me a great deal. Baha and Rafat, I've known you a little bit longer perhaps, but you've shown me and you've taught me a great deal. And I think we all learned a great deal from this panel over the last, you were right, we didn't keep it to an hour. It went much longer than planned. But there's a lot to say, and there's a lot more to say, and I really appreciate your time and your generosity and your knowledge and the work that you do. Let's bring Jamil back in and maybe see if we can squeeze in 2 or 3 questions. These guys have given us a lot of their time. I don't want to, take advantage of it too much, but perhaps 2 or 3 good questions that you can identify.
Sure. So this question is from Jennifer. The question is, regarding giving tours, have you had the chance to speak to groups of evangelicals from the US? And if so, have you ever been able to make progress with them regarding opening their eyes to the Palestinian truths and realities? I think Americans are the toughest ones to get through to. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, evangelicals are a tough one. Have either one of you had evangelicals come on your tours? Khaled, anything?
I mean, I didn't give the tour myself, but my colleague Fairuz did, and it was interesting because it was a member in a diversified group, so it wasn't a whole evangelical group. So it was a bit easier because the rest of the group was doing the work for us in shutting them down, or like, here, you see it for yourself. What are you still arguing about? What was interesting is that we did once get an evangelical group that is with different politics. I can't recall it right now, but I remember being told that there is a movement for Palestinians within the evangelical community in the state as well. That was the one time that we met them, actually.
Baha, have you had any evangelicals come on your tours?
Yeah. Once again, like for me, like it doesn't matter who joins, because those who think they know, they realize it's actually more profound and more systematic than they thought. I feel like those who don't know are much easier to help them understand the reality than those who think they know. Because like to open up the different aspects of and forms of Israeli oppression to somebody who knows, like, you are ending up giving them more information that they have to resist in order to keep the information that they already have, in order to keep the opinions they already developed for themselves. For evangelists, it's kind of easier because after the second day, they realize that they are misinformed and fooled. Like, I had a priest crying, regretting 40 years of his preaching, for God bless you and God bless Israel. It's like for 40 years. And then I feared for his health, actually, because he was pretty shocked by the reality and how comprehensive it is. You had people who would go on and try to mediate between the reality of oppression and the religious belief that they have, that Benjamin Netanyahu is a prophet, or David Ben-Gurion is, is a tool from God, and then realize that all those are racist atheists who abuse religion to justify wrongdoings. It's actually much easier to deal with a man of faith because then you can bring their faith into the education. And nobody can nobody can have a debate with you over certain teachings of Christ. So I find like religious groups easier to deal with than people have like come from a culture of supremacy. You know, people who normalize supremacy and people who see you as an inferior and treat you with a condescending attitude. Those also like they find it pretty difficult, especially when they're confronted with the fact like, why should a Palestinian accept something less than what you were born with? Like, you know, when white supremacists join my tours, they'll be like, and ask me like, Baha, what do you want? And it's like, I want exactly what you have. And then they freak out, you know? So religious people, doesn't matter if the religious background is Jewish faith or Christian faith or even Muslim faith, which is also like interesting to deal with, because they end up realizing that Palestine is not home for Muslims only, which is really weird. And this conflict is not Muslims versus Jews. So that kind of, like I find it like easier to deal with religious people who come here. Religious people who realize that even though they were sold Bethlehem as an Israeli site, they figure out that, oh, Christ was actually born in Bethlehem and he might have been brown.
And he was a Palestinian, and he was actually
He was a Palestinian. Like,
how about you,
know,
Rafat? Have you had any evangelicals? Do you get?
I don't know who these guys are.
You don't know who
Christian Zionists.
You're not missing anything. You haven't missed anything. I promise.
I'd like to meet them.
Let's try one more. Let's try the way we go. I think we only have time for one more. So let's do one more question.
Okay. This next question is from Blake. The question is, how do the three of you manage not to be jailed or worse by the Zionist entity?
Oh, actually, we did.
Yeah, I think there's an assumption that you haven't.
You said they weren't. But Blake also asked something about the one democratic state, but I think we also talked about that.
Yeah.
Let's try a different one, because these guys are activists. I mean, getting arrested is
it's like you're stuck in the house, man.
Yeah, and let's talk. Let's try one more question, a different one.
Sure. This question is from Ziad. The question is, so there's two questions. One, there's questions for Khaled. Did the proposed law, the national identity law, affect the number of Druze refuseniks? I think you went into this a little bit at the end, but the other part is if you have worked with any Druze in the Golan community.
If there's a connection between the Druze in Palestine and the Druze in the Golan, in the occupied Golan.
I mean, there is a connection, a religious communal connection between the Druze in Palestine who have Israeli citizenship and the Druze in the Golan Heights who are Syrian and who don't have Israeli citizenship majorly, except maybe like 1% who accepted it.
Don't have it because they refused it, right? They were offered it, but they refused it, right?
Yeah. So that's what I was saying. Like the 1% that accepted it since 1967, who are mere collaborators anyway with the Zionist regime in there. So it's also an occupied territory. So politically speaking, there is a gap between the Druze in Palestine and the Druze in the Golan Heights because it's different issues or different contexts. But for us as activists in the refusing movement, we know today that attempts are being made to recruit people from the Golan Heights, especially through the channel of civil service, which is a substitute for military service for those who can't do it for any reason in the in Israel. But it's also the same system. It comes from the same office, the Office of Israeli Defense. And basically, it's another place where youth is brainwashed to become more Israeli, to get more assimilated in the Israeli society in general. So we are aware, we connect with the activists there around these issues, mostly when it comes to politics. But since access is free between the gallery where most of the Druze in Palestine are and the Golan Heights, and they are adjacent geographies, we do have the communal and family ties. Just to point out, that's very true because Druze only marry Druze, so it's a thing, and we're not much here, so we don't have much options as well. So that had to happen.
Thank you, Khaled. Okay, thank you all three of you. We really need to go. I can't thank the three of you enough. Rafat, Baha, Khaled, the work that you do is absolutely inspiring. It's really the most important probably work that's being done in Palestine. There's no question about that. The myth that there's no Palestinian leadership, I think, is you disprove it every single day with your existence and the work that you do, because you are leaders and you are you are the Palestinian leadership. The activism, I've spoken to you guys about everything from politics to history to Palestinian culture. Your knowledge is vast and deep, and I really encourage people, once travel is possible again, to take advantage of the incredible knowledge and love that you have about Palestine, and to take advantage of the tours, otherwise follow you in every possible way. Whatever is possible these days with social media and so forth. Thank you again for your time, for your generosity, for your friendship. And I look forward to seeing all of you again soon in Palestine. So thank you all.
Thank you, Miko.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.